Since before I even started playing, a common misconception was that Vintage is a turn 1 combo format with non interactive goldfishing games. This incorrect assumption kept many players away from what is actually a fun and engaging format. But now, some Vintage regulars are complaining that it has become too fast and that this misconception is now reality. My name is Justin, I'm Max Level 1, and this is Voice of Vintage. Welcome back, Vintage gamers, to Voice of Vintage. There's been a lot of rumblings inside of the online Vintage community over the past few months. Many players are expressing their disdain for what they perceive to be a format speed increase and have been expressing their views on how they would like to fix it. Today, I'm going to go over some of the most common things that I've heard in the Discord and their reasons and viability. And I want to just preface this by saying none of these options are my preference. Personally, I've always stated I think the banned and restricted list should be based primarily around win rate balancing and not on format experience and that kind of fun gameplay tailoring. But the goal here is going to be what people suggest they would like to do to help slow down the format. So let's take a look at the biggest culprits of format acceleration. There's one big elephant in the room before we begin. I really think it should be mentioned. It's unfortunately not something that is likely to ever change. And that's the London Mulligan. Implemented in June of 2019, this overhaul to the Mulligan system in all Magic formats, note all Magic formats, has deeply impacted internal constructed formats. And I would probably say for the negative. From what I hear, a overall positive for limited environments and a contested positive or negative for younger constructed formats. But for eternal formats, especially for Vintage, I think that the London Mulligan giving you access to more cohesive hands and it just directly results in more powerful hands across all archetypes, but especially for combo. And I view this as something that it probably will never be changed because they don't want to have, different mulligans for different formats. As it's something that can't really be changed, I don't think I want to delve too much deeper into it. I just wanted to point out that I think the London Mulligan is a key underlying factor that is really hard to calculate. It's hard to calculate its effect on the format, but I do think it has resulted in some amount of format acceleration. So let's actually just talk about Magic cards here. Surprisingly, or well, not really surprisingly if you follow the Magic community in any way, there's very little consensus among Vintage players about which cards are the main drivers for format speed increase. So I'm not going to go and say these are a strict order on which is the most, but what I'm going to do is just show you cards that I believe are the main drivers, not in order, and I will also give you what my personal opinions are on as we go. For me, Bazaar of Baghdad is got to be culprit number one. Its corresponding Dredge, Countervine, Agrovine decks are, I think, the strongest influencer on format speed increase. This collection of decks is extremely and notoriously hard for slower decks to manage. Obviously, that varies to certain degrees. An Agrovine deck has a harder matchup against a Swords to Plowshare deck than a Swords to Plowshare deck might have against something like Dredge. But for the most part, it is very hard to play a fair game plan against Bazaar of Baghdad. A single Bazaar of Baghdad activation can generate double-digit mana value advantages, and it really can just put a slower deck out of contention on the very first turn of the game. With the newest addition of 4 more Root Wallas, the Vine decks have really achieved a level of consistency on turn 1 free power that is extremely hard to battle from like a creature-to-creature standpoint. It kind of forces you to go deep into Tabernacle of the Pendrel Veil to stop this kind of dumping of creatures onto the table. When you combine that with the fact that Hollow One and Force of Vigor allow for easy answers to conventional graveyard hate pieces, this creates a really frustrating experience for slow decks, and the traditional answers just don't get the job done. So you're really forced to extremes like Leyline plus Tabernacle. And you'll see this a lot. Lots of vintage decks are running 4 Leyline, 2 Tabernacle. No matter what deck it is. Even like the combo-oriented decks are sometimes running this 4 Leyline, 2 Tabernacle package. And obviously, the culprit here is the land, Bazaar of Baghdad. That is the enabler. That is the reason the reason that this is an issue. But as it's been previously stated in banned and restricted announcements, Bazaar of Baghdad is considered a pillar of the format and as kind of a protected status. It's not a card that is going to be restricted because people come to Vintage to play Bazaar of Baghdad. And so you don't want to, remove one of the, or at least Wizards don't want to remove one of the reasons people want to play Vintage. So while that card is the problem, we have to do something about other cards if you want to slow down Bazaar of Baghdad. My personal opinion here is that Hollow One is probably the card that has overstayed its welcome. This card allows Dredge to play outside of the graveyard to a staggering level and enables all of Vine's strongest free creature draws. This card really allows these decks to play on another axis, and the sheer amount of power that it generates for 0 mana is extremely effective. Now, it's probably also possible that you could trim one of the 2 Root Wallas, restricting one of the 2 Root Wallas. I would probably say you would want to restrict the green one to bring down the green count for Force of Vigor. But I feel like that's probably not enough, and it wouldn't really be a huge deal. These decks were operating pretty effectively on 4 Root Wallas, so I don't think 5 Root Wallas would be a huge deal. Another similar option is restricting Force of Vigor. I think it does a similar thing where you are going to take away those decks' ability to easily interact with a number of counter pieces. However, I'm really skeptical about restricting Vigor because it has impact on the format outside of just Bazaar of Baghdad. It is definitely a card that enables some more fair green-based archetypes, whether they're blue or non-blue. And I would rather not, sideswipe those decks that are not performing well, and Vigor is a key piece in making those decks work. And so I think the more reasonable hit would be Hollow One, as it is just directly affecting the Bazaar decks. I definitely think that if you restrict Hollow One, these Bazaar decks get less. They obviously slow down. The Vine decks are going to slow down. I'm not even sure how good the Vine decks are or what exactly their capabilities would be with only one Hollow One. And it would actually put Dredge into some kind of other options for beating Graveyard Hate, which I think is a good thing. Obviously, it's a little bit polarizing for the Dredge deck, but it's also a little bit if you are putting in Graveyard Hate and your opponent just puts in 8 free power and you die to that. So it's a little bit here, a little bit there. It's tough to say, with any kind of certainty, because what this is really not a balance hit. It's a format speed exercise. We're trying to make the format slower, and I think that Hollow One would be the one you would want to use to slow down Bazaar of Baghdad decks. Okay, culprit number 2 here, Urza Saga. Bane of Boomer's existence, slayer of control decks, the strongest land in 10 years. Make sure you check out that video. It's one of my best works, I swear. It's kind of ironic to me that such a slow card could be speeding up the format. But here's how the logic goes. This is definitely what people have told me from the perspective of a control deck. Slow decks can't beat this card in the long game, so the best way to combat it is to ignore it and go faster. Obviously, this is the logic that I've used in the past for PO. I especially repeat that it is more valuable for you to not invest mana into Saga when you are playing a PO versus Saga Mirror, and you're better off trying to do your fast combo. But it kind of seems like even with the inclusion of Wastelands, these slower decks are still struggling to combat Saga. That's very surprising to me. I've definitely had instances where if you play Wastelands in combination with some enchantment spot removal, you have a really reasonable time of answering Saga. But the problem, it's become pretty obvious, and at least you can like readily look at the problem when you see the rise of Jewel Shops. Jewel Shops is a turn 1, turn 2 combo deck that has a Saga as a plan B. So it really, what Saga does for the Jewel Shops deck, it enables you to go all in on turn 1 and turn 2. You could go for 6 pieces of fast mana, not 6 pieces of fast mana, but like Workshop plus 3 3 mana worth of fast mana, and go for the turn 1 6-drop. And if your turn 1 6-drop gets countered, it's fine, because on turn 2 you play PO or you play a second Jewel. And if that gets countered, it's still fine because your land is now going to make you 2 5/5s and kill your opponent anyways. So if your opponent stocks up a bunch of counter magic to counter your turn 2, turn 1 combo deck, which, you know, that makes a lot of sense, it doesn't really help because you just slam some Sagas and afterwards and everything is fine. Saga really allows Jewel, which is one of the fastest decks in the format, to really abuse these counterable haymakers because they can just sit back on the Saga plan. It's really actually probably the most damning use of Saga that I've seen yet. Something that really expresses the power of Saga in my mind. And yeah, it's clearly abusable. This Jewel deck is doing very well recently. And it's the kind of deck you really don't want to exist from a format speed and a fun perspective. Jewel is a little bit too much, and a little bit too fast. It's very different from something, say, like Oops All Spells, where Oops All Spells is probably a similar speed, if not maybe like half a turn faster than Jewel. But Oops All Spells has no backup plan. If you counter and you stop their graveyard, they don't have any plan afterwards. They die. And so that's really the difference in my mind between something like Oops and something like Jewel Shops. I mean, personally, I still think that Saga is both a slow and answerable card for control decks. But maybe when you're combining, the fact that a control deck has to answer Doomsday, Tinker, Mono White, and Bazaar, that the fact that, it comes hard to justify fitting these, Wear Tears and March of the Otherworldly Lights in your deck that will also hit the Sagas. So here, if you restrict Saga, this strips away Jewel's backup plan. It turns it more into a combo Oops All Spells deck, and it'll make it easier to deal with things like Counter and Null Rod. Culprit number 3, Bolas's Citadel. Now, this is simple, really. Tinker used to be, suspend 1, probably win the game with a big giant robot. Now, Tinker mostly reads just win the game. Many game actions are taken after you resolve your Tinker and put Bolas's Citadel into play, but for the most part, they're kind of irrelevant. It can sometimes be a fun puzzle to solve for the Tinker player, but for the most part, Citadel in play is winning. It's just winning the game. And all of these slow decks now have to worry about every fast mana deck going turn 1 Tinker. And even if that's not a high percentage of the time, it's enough of a worry that you can't, you really can't, go shields down. You have to keep a hand with force. You have to do X, Y, and Z because the threat of Tinker Citadel is super strong. And an outright banning of Citadel is what would be required here. Would immediately slow down all of these big blue decks and leave the strongest play is probably just PO. Turn 1 PO, which is a thing that happens, but it's not a thing that happens super consistently, and it's a much more answerable thing. Obviously, a banning in Vintage is somewhat unprecedented. You have a certain cat to thank for the fact that it's somewhat. But for the most part, cards don't get banned in Vintage. So this is not something I'm sure that WotC is okay with. Is this an idea on banning restrictions in Vintage that would sit well with both WotC and the old player base? I'm not really sure. But I can tell you that I don't think I've ever seen someone express a strong dislike for this idea. Most players in Vintage, including Tinker players, are pretty over Bolas's Citadel. I think it was fun and powerful for a time, but maybe that time has to come to an end. I do think that Tinker robots, Sphinx to Steelwind, Blasto Colossus is still a thing that is powerful, but it's a much more answerable thing, and it's a much slower thing, right? You have to take an extra turn, and it has to survive, and there has to be no blockers. There's a lot of things that have to go right for your Blightsteel to connect and win the game. So it's simple. If you want the format to slow down, a ban of Bolas's Citadel will definitely help. All right, we've got another culprit in the room. Doomsday. The hashtag best deck in the format, says Justin, is known for turn 1 and turn 2 kills. Many counterspells to back up these turn 1 and turn 2 kills in a similar way that Jewel Shops doesn't really suffer from a failed early combo. Doomsday kind of negates the failed early combo with a cantrip heavy deck construction, or just having enough counterspells that you won't ever fail your combo. Unfortunately, I don't actually think there's a super compelling way to slow Doomsday down without just completely axing the deck. People have suggested preordain, but I don't think preordain is like a super big part of the Doomsday part, the fastness of the Doomsday deck. Obviously, it helps combat a failed combo, but the real problem is the combo itself is just too easy. Too fast, too easy, and you can just have so many counter spells. So you could do something like a Dark Ritual restriction, but I think that's kind of I don't know. It seems like it's a restriction of space and restricting another supporting card, where you really should just be restricting Doomsday itself. There's no pillar of the format here holding Doomsday up that you can restrict Doomsday, and I think everything will be fine. No one is gonna lose their mind or leave the format because of it. Well, maybe that's not true. I should probably not say that one, but I do think that I personally would just say good riddance. This deck is way too good, and I do think that axing Doomsday is probably the best way to handle it, but I do think a Doomsday restriction will probably just kill off the deck. I think there could be an Oracle-based combo deck that replaces it. I've tried these decks in the past, and they are weaker than Doomsday, but they are totally effective. Thassa's Oracle is a broken Magic card, and there are a lot of things that combo with Thassa's Oracle. So there's a possibility that there is another blue-black based combo deck if you restrict Doomsday. There'll probably have to be some soul searching. So I would just feel that if you restricted Citadel, or sorry, if you banned Citadel, restricted Hollow One, and restricted banned Citadel, what am I missing? Restricted Saga, and you just left Doomsday, like what is preying on Doomsday is about to run you over. It's possible that like a resurgence of Breach decks maybe could put Doomsday down with a Saga restriction, and a Hollow One restriction. Maybe Breach comes back, and that might hold Doomsday down. I would just be very skeptical that if you did nothing to affect Doomsday and you nerfed every other deck in the format, is that a good idea? And that also brings us to culprit number 5, which is a similar question. What about Mono White? This is more of like less concrete and more of a question. I'm not sure Mono White is a culprit of the fastness of the format. Mono White may be a symptom rather than a cause. The way Initiative is currently being built with these Chancellors, it is actually being built like a turn 1 combo deck. You are trying to put a turn 1 uncounterable Archon into play, or whatever other piece into play. And I don't know if that is because the format is so fast, it needs to be built like that, or if that is simply just the best way to be building Magic decks. It's possible that the format slows down and Mono White players say, I'm still going to try to play a turn 1 Archon with Cavern of Souls and Chancellor backup, because that's actually just the best strategy. And that would make me sad. But who knows? Maybe that's just how Magic is. Control players have expressed to me that they feel like they can beat the Initiative mechanic. So I don't know if we need to be worried about a slower format and the Initiative mechanic itself. Again, I still think the strongest card in Mono White is by far Archon of Emeria, because this card shuts down your entire opponent's deck. Your opponent can't draw cards to find. It's very hard for your opponent to fetch and get fetchable mana to play their spells. They can't cast multiple cantrips and find removal spells. They can't combo kill. Archon is seriously powerful. So my question would be, I guess, what does mono white look like if you are doing this kind of format speed decrease? And so it's all very interesting thought. If you were to restrict Hollow One, restrict Saga, restrict Doomsday, ban Citadel, maybe restrict Archon, what does Vintage look like? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it more fun? Is it slower? I don't really know. It's a really huge change. This is, again, just not how I suggest you utilize a ban and restriction list. I much prefer the idea of balancing based on win rates and meta shares, and this idea of an across the board sledgehammer nerf to try to slow down the format and artificially produce slower gameplay isn't really something I vibe with as a competitive player. I really enjoy trying to find holes in established metagames and working within the constraints. So it's not something that makes me super excited, but it is something that's very interesting to talk about. And I've been following the conversation closer than normal, I would say, inside of the Discord. So I kind of want to hear what you have to say. How would you feel about nerfing Vintage across the board and slowing down the format? Let me know in the comments below. Maybe you have different suggestions. Maybe you think different cards are the reason that the format speed has increased. I guess you could also say you don't think that the format speed has increased. I feel like that one's a little bit harder to argue, though. Again, let me know in the comments. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, boost the algorithm. These videos aren't always the strongest, so I would appreciate any help I can get. And don't worry, there will be new gameplay videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern on this channel. I'll see you then.